Welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast. We're here to show you how practical psychology can be useful and make your workplace better. I'm Dr. Ernest Wayde. When we left Dr. Carter last week, she had just received some bad news. She had been informed that Blue Rivers had to change their EHR, the Electronic Health Record System, to match that of Optima Health System, OHS, in the next 6 months. Along with this unplanned change, Dr. Carter also had to deal with the current financial losses, the staff turnover and absenteeism, the aftermath of the acquisition and the public image of the hospital, and her own lack of time given she still saw patients and tried to do research. Dr. Carter was feeling overwhelmed, anxious, and stressed, and it began to show in her behaviors. Let's get back to the story. After a couple of weeks, Dr. Carter decided she needed to find a way out of this slump and focus on helping the organization get ready for this additional change. But she didn't know where to start. She turned to her psychologist friend because, as we all know, psychologists are great listeners. Dr. Carter's psychologist friend recommended Dr. Carter hire a consultant to help her come up with a change management plan. But first, the psychologist recommended Dr. Carter needed to spend some time understanding and processing her own change journey. Dr. Carter, like a lot of leaders, had not received much in the way of change management training, and so she asked for more information to help her understand what this meant. The psychologist explained that much like the behavioral chain analysis Mr. Ramirez had done with the nurses, it was important to understand the cause and effect of change on each person if you wanted to properly understand their reactions to change that occurred as a part of each person's change journey. Dr. Carter was still not sure what this meant or how it would help her, so she asked the psychologist to explain it a little bit more. The psychologist took Dr. Carter through an exercise where Dr. Carter first identified the cause of the change. In this case, the cause of the EHR change was an organizational requirement that was mandated by OHS. When asked to identify the impact of this change, Dr. Carter immediately went to the impact of the organization. But the psychologist reminded Dr. Carter that they were focused on her own individual change journey and to focus on the impact of the change to her personally first. How would it impact her as a physician and then as the organizational leader? Dr. Carter had not thought of it this way, but after some reflection was able to identify that as a physician, engaging in a new change meant she would be slower in her work during the learning process, which would result in losing more time she already didn't have. That need for additional time and workflow disruption might mean Dr. Carter might have to give up her clinical work, and she did not want to do that. Additionally, as someone who prided herself on her ability to do everything because of her efficiency, learning a new EHR was an inefficient experience, and inefficiencies frustrated Dr. Carter. As a leader, Dr. Carter realized that this new EHR might undermine the little good she had established with the nurses. It might mean she could not prioritize their needs as she had indicated. As someone who valued ethics and integrity highly, Dr. Carter was concerned about other people's impression of her. The psychologist explained that these impacts were causing an emotional response and asked Dr. Carter to try and identify the emotions these impacts evoked in her. Dr. Carter was able to identify frustration, anxiety, helplessness, and anger as driving emotions. The psychologist then explained that our behaviors are often driven by emotions and asked Dr. Carter to identify the behaviors that were associated with her emotions. Dr. Carter thought about her behavior over the last couple of weeks since her meeting with OHS and easily identified that her defiance and abrasiveness with OHS, her despondency and disengagement with her own staff, and her frustration and skepticism with herself and her abilities was due to the emotions that she had identified that she was feeling. The psychologist then explained that resistance to change and resulting behaviors is actually a normal response and should be expected and can actually be helpful to humans. This confused Dr. Carter, who had always thought of resistance as a bad thing. She asked the psychologist to explain further. The psychologist explained that resistance is a natural human response. In fact, change can be challenging for many of us because our brains are wired to prefer routine and familiarity. It's similar to how starting a new exercise routine can be tough. It's a shift from what we're used to. When we face change, our brains need to create new connections and coordinate various processes, which requires extra effort and energy. Since our brains already use a significant amount of our body's energy, they tend to resist additional work. The psychologist explained that when we encounter change, our brains may see it as a threat, triggering a stress response. This stress response is managed by a part of our brain which operates on a subconscious level. So for most of us, without our awareness and control, it's that part of the brain that is responsible for our fight or flight reaction, which can make us less open to new ideas and affect our decision-making abilities, making it very difficult for us to accept change. As a physician, Dr. Carter knew and understood the biology of the brain, but had never thought of it in the context of the psychological impact of change and the resulting behavioral response. She found this information very helpful in giving her a greater understanding of why she was behaving as she was, and also gave her greater insight into why her employees behaved the way they did when presented with change. From a psychological and biological perspective, behaviors that look like uncooperative and disruptive resistance were mostly a natural response to change. Let's stop the story there. Understanding this natural resistance to change can help us approach change more compassionately, both for ourselves and others. It's not always that we're unwilling to change, it's just that our brains need a little more time and convincing to embark on the journey and spend the energy. And as a leader, it's important to remember this fact. Most leaders forget their resistance in their journey to first hearing of a change. A lot of leaders also need time and convincing before they get on board with a change. But when they communicate that change to their employees, they're often surprised when they meet resistance. They forget that they resisted at first and often have had weeks or months to accept the change and work through their individual journey. As a leader, I encourage you to remember that you are like everyone else and your resistance to change is normal. As a leader, I also want to encourage you to remember that when you eventually accept and communicate that change to your employees, their resistance to change is normal and should be expected. Good news is there are ways to help yourself and your team move through resistance to acceptance, and we'll talk about that next time. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving us a review. Feedback is a gift, and we love gifts. Thank you for listening. I hope you will join us again next time.